The story of the space race begins long before rockets reached the sky. It begins here, on Earth, in a time when two great powers watched each other with both fear and pride. It was the late 1940s and early 1950s. The world had just survived World War II, a terrible war that had destroyed cities, taken millions of lives, and left deep scars on almost every country. When the war ended in 1945, people all over the world felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and hope. They wanted peace. They wanted to rebuild their homes, their countries, and their futures. But peace did not mean everything was calm, because two great nations, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, also called the USSR, had become rivals. Both of these countries were strong, powerful, and proud. They had fought together against Nazi Germany during the war, but afterward they could not agree on how the world should be shaped. America believed in democracy, where people could vote freely and speak their minds. The Soviet Union believed in communism, where the government controlled most things and said everyone should be equal. Each side thought their way was the best. And so even though they were not fighting directly, they entered a quiet, tense competition known as the Cold War. The Cold War was not a war of soldiers and tanks. It was a war of ideas, technology, and power. Instead of bullets, there were inventions. Instead of bombs, there were scientific achievements. Each side wanted to prove that their system, democracy or communism, was stronger, smarter, and more advanced. Every invention, every discovery, every new machine became a symbol of pride. If one side built something new, the other side rushed to build something better. At the same time, both countries were developing rockets. Originally, rockets were designed as weapons, to carry bombs or travel long distances in war. But soon, scientists began to see something greater in them. They started to dream. Could these rockets go beyond Earth? Could humans actually reach space? For centuries, humans had looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. From ancient times, people watched the night sky, telling stories about constellations, the moon, and planets. But now, for the first time, humans had the technology to actually go there. In both the United States and the Soviet Union, brilliant scientists were working on rockets. Some of these scientists had studied rockets for many years, even before the war. One famous name was Wernher von Braun, a German engineer who had worked on rocket designs during World War II. After the war ended, he moved to the United States, where he began helping American scientists develop rockets for peaceful uses, and later for space. In the Soviet Union, there was another genius named Sergei Korolev. He was a man of great vision and determination. He had suffered through prison camps under Stalin's rule, but never gave up his dream of space travel. Korolev believed that one day humans would fly beyond the sky. He wanted the Soviet Union to be the first to achieve it. Neither country announced their goals openly at first. Everything was secret. Scientists worked in hidden laboratories and military bases. Blueprints were locked away. Every test was carefully recorded, but few people outside the projects even knew what was happening. Still, the dream was alive, to send something, anything, into space. To understand what made this dream so big, let's imagine what space means. Space is everything beyond Earth's atmosphere, the endless darkness above the blue sky. When you look up at night and see stars twinkling, You're looking into space. It's silent, airless, and cold. There's no wind, no sound, no air to breathe. It's a place where no human could survive without special protection. To reach space, you need something powerful enough to escape Earth's gravity, the invisible pull that keeps everything on the ground. It's like trying to throw a ball so high that it never comes back down. To do that, you need an enormous amount of speed and energy, something only a rocket can provide. This is why rockets became the key to the dream of space. In the 1940s and 50s, rockets were still very new. They exploded often. They failed to lift off. Sometimes they flew sideways instead of upward. Scientists had to test again and again, learning from every mistake. In America, small rocket teams tested engines in the deserts of New Mexico. In the Soviet Union, scientists worked in freezing cold military bases, far from the public eye. Each side wanted to build a rocket that could go higher than ever before. But while scientists dreamed of exploration, military leaders saw something else. They saw rockets as powerful weapons, missiles that could deliver bombs from one side of the world to the other, and that made the rivalry even more serious. The better your rockets, the safer your country. Or at least that's what both sides believed. Still, some scientists whispered quietly, what if these rockets could carry something peaceful instead, like a satellite? A satellite is a machine that orbits or goes around a planet. You can think of it like the moon. The moon is Earth's natural satellite because it goes around our planet. But what if humans could build an artificial one? A satellite could do amazing things. It could take pictures of Earth from above. It could send radio signals around the world. It could help scientists understand weather, space, and even help people communicate faster. Both the United States and the Soviet Union liked the idea, but both wanted to be first. Being first in space meant showing the whole world who was the true leader of science and technology. It wasn't just about exploration, it was about pride, power, and proof. So in secret, both nations began preparing for the same goal, to launch the world's first artificial satellite into orbit. People didn't know much about what was going on behind the scenes, but they could feel something big was coming. Newspapers often spoke of missiles, nuclear weapons, and superpowers. Children in America practiced hiding under desks during drills, afraid of nuclear war. In the Soviet Union, people were told they lived in the strongest, most advanced nation on Earth. It was a time of both fear and hope. People feared war, but also hoped for peace through science. They saw rockets not only as weapons, but also as symbols of human progress. And in small classrooms across the world, teachers would point at the stars and say, "Someday, maybe we'll go there." No one knew that this someday was just around the corner. Before the first satellite, there were small experiments. Scientists sent tiny rockets carrying instruments to study how the air changes with height. They sent cameras to take photos of Earth's curvature, the first time humans saw their planet from above. They sent animals like fruit flies and monkeys in small capsules to learn if living creatures could survive short flights. Every success brought them a little closer. Every failure taught them what not to do. By the mid-1950s, the dream was no longer just a dream. It was almost ready to happen. The question was, who would do it first? In 1955, the United States made a public announcement. They said that during the upcoming International Geophysical Year, 1957 to 1958, they would launch a small satellite into orbit. It was meant to be a peaceful mission, showing cooperation and progress for all humanity. The plan was to use a rocket called Vanguard. The project was ambitious and open. Scientists from around the world knew about it. The U.S. wanted to show that they weren't hiding anything, that science could be shared. But far away, in the Soviet Union, a man named Sergei Korolev was listening. And he had a different idea. Korolev and his team were working in deep secrecy. They didn't make public announcements. They didn't talk to the media. But they were already building something. A small, shiny metal sphere with antennas. The design was simple but clever. The satellite didn't need cameras or sensors. It just needed to send out a signal, a simple beep beep that would prove it was in orbit. Korolev knew that speed mattered more than perfection. If they waited too long, the Americans might beat them. So he pushed his team harder and harder, through long nights and cold winters. He believed in one goal: to launch the first satellite before anyone else on Earth. By 1957, the world was standing unknowingly on the edge of a new era. Airplanes were the highest form of travel known to man. Televisions were just becoming popular. Computers filled entire rooms. No one had ever seen space with their own eyes. And yet within just a few months, everything would change. A small object, no bigger than a beach ball, would rise into the sky and stay there, circling the planet again and again. When that moment came, it would change how humans saw themselves forever. It would show that the sky was no longer the limit. It would prove that humanity could reach beyond Earth. And so, as the sun set on a quiet October evening in 1957, deep inside a launch site in Kazakhstan, a rocket stood ready. Engines fueled, scientists tense. A silent countdown began. The world was about to hear a new sound, a sound that would not only echo through radios, but through all of human history. It was a quiet evening on October 4, 1957. Most people in the Soviet Union were at home, eating dinner, reading newspapers, or listening to the radio. They had no idea that something incredible was about to happen above their heads. At a secret launch site called Baikonur Cosmodrome in the cold Kazakh steppe, a tall silver rocket stood ready. The rocket was called the R-7 Semyorka, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, now given a new mission. Inside its nose was a small metal sphere, a ball about the size of a beach ball, weighing only 83 kilograms. That little sphere carried no humans, no weapons, and no camera. It had only one job: to beep. Just 2 radio transmitters, 4 long antennas, and a battery. But those tiny beeps would soon shake the entire world. The launch pad was surrounded by engineers, scientists, and soldiers. Their breath fogged the freezing air. Their hearts pounded. The man leading them, Sergei Korolev, stood quietly, eyes fixed on the rocket. He was not a general, not a soldier, but a dreamer. He had spent years dreaming of space when everyone else only dreamed of power. Now, at last, his dream was seconds away. 10, 9, 8. The final countdown began. As the numbers fell, everyone held their breath. 3, 2, 1. Launch. With a thunderous roar, the rocket's engines ignited. Flames burst out beneath it, lighting up the night sky like sunrise. The rocket trembled, then began to rise, slowly at first, then faster and faster into the dark. The R-7 climbed higher, pushing against gravity with all its power. Inside, Sputnik 1 sat quietly, waiting to be released. Minutes passed. The rocket reached the edge of Earth's atmosphere. Then, click, the satellite separated. It was free. For the first time in history, a human-made object was now circling the planet. At that exact moment, humanity entered a new age, the space age. Soon after separation, Sputnik's radio came alive. It began sending a steady signal back to Earth. Beep, beep, beep. The sound was simple, just short radio pulses. But for scientists who tuned in, it was breathtaking. Each beep meant the satellite was alive. Each beep meant it was orbiting successfully, about once every 96 minutes, traveling 29,000 kilometers per hour. People with amateur radios across the world could hear it. In the United States, in Europe, in Japan, even children with small antennas picked up that mysterious sound. It was as if the sky itself had begun to talk. The next morning, newspapers carried a shocking headline. Soviets launch first satellite into space. The news spread like wildfire. People stepped outside at night looking up at the stars, wondering if they could spot it. Sputnik was small, but sunlight sometimes reflected off its shiny surface. To the naked eye, it looked like a tiny moving star drifting across the sky. Families stood in backyards whispering, "There it is, the Russian satellite." Some were amazed, some were frightened, but everyone knew the world had changed overnight. In the Soviet Union, the reaction was pure joy. For decades, their people had faced war, hunger, and hardship. Now they had beaten the mighty United States to space. Newspapers called it a victory for socialism. Posters showed Sputnik flying proudly above the Earth with the red Soviet flag beside it. Children were told in schools that they belonged to the smartest, most advanced nation in the world. Sergei Korolev's name, however, remained a secret. He was known only as the chief designer, his identity hidden for security reasons. But inside, he smiled quietly, knowing he had just changed human history. Across the ocean, in the United States, the mood was very different. When Americans heard that the Soviets had launched a satellite, many were in disbelief. How could they have done it first? People asked. The U.S. had better universities, bigger budgets, and more scientists. But the truth was clear. The Soviets had reached space first. For many Americans, this was not just a scientific surprise, it was a national shock. If the Soviets could launch a satellite into orbit, that meant they had rockets powerful enough to deliver nuclear weapons anywhere on Earth. It was a frightening thought. Newspapers wrote dramatic headlines like "Red Moon over America" and "Soviet Beep Alarms World." Television shows displayed animations of Sputnik orbiting Earth, and politicians began demanding answers. Though Sputnik 1 was small and harmless, its success became a symbol, proof that the Soviet Union was ahead in science and technology. People realized that the future of power was no longer measured just in armies or weapons, but in knowledge and innovation. The space race had officially begun. For the first time, countries saw that whoever mastered space would lead the future. Space meant satellites, communication, and perhaps one day control over the skies themselves. The United States quickly began to respond. Scientists rushed back to their laboratories. Universities increased funding for physics and engineering. The government decided that if America wanted to stay strong, it needed to invest in science more than ever before. Let's take a moment to imagine what Sputnik really looked like. It wasn't large or fancy. It was a shiny aluminum sphere, about 58 centimeters wide. 4 long antennas extended from its sides like silver whiskers. Inside were 2 transmitters, a battery, and a temperature control system. There were no cameras, no computers, no people, only simplicity and perfection. Yet it was strong enough to survive the violence of launch and the cold of space. Sputnik orbited Earth about 1,440 times before its battery died after 21 days. Even when it stopped beeping, it continued circling for almost 3 months before finally burning up in Earth's atmosphere on January 4, 1958. When it finally fell, people all over the world felt a strange sadness, as if the little satellite that had spoken from the sky had finally said goodbye. Every beep that Sputnik sent carried data. It helped scientists study how radio waves behaved in the upper atmosphere. It also showed that satellites could survive in orbit, something no one was sure about before. Ground stations tracked its path. Engineers learned how to measure altitude, speed, and temperature from far away. It was a small step, but it opened doors to many new discoveries. Even though most of the world didn't know his name, Sergei Korolev became a legend among Soviet scientists. He was born in 1907 in Ukraine. From childhood, he loved building gliders and model planes. He dreamed of flying higher than birds. Life was not kind to him. He was arrested in the 1930s during Stalin's purges and sent to a labor camp. Years later, he was released to work on rocket research. Despite his suffering, he never lost his dream. When Sputnik 1 succeeded, he didn't celebrate with champagne or parties. He simply wrote in his notebook, "We did it. Humanity is in space." Sputnik's success lit a fire of competition. Within a month, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 2, this time carrying a living passenger, Laika, a small stray dog from Moscow. Laika became the first living creature to orbit Earth. Although she did not survive the mission, her courage became famous. The world wept and admired her, and scientists learned valuable lessons about life in space. Meanwhile, in America, engineers worked night and day to catch up. They tried to launch their own satellite, Vanguard TV3, in December 1957. But when the rocket lifted off, it rose a few feet, then exploded in flames on live television. The crowd gasped. The newspapers called it Flopnik. The embarrassment was huge. The U.S. had the resources, but the Soviets had the momentum. In schools across the world, children suddenly became fascinated with space. They drew rockets in their notebooks. They built model satellites. Science fairs became popular. Teachers talked about the stars, planets, and the universe with excitement. People began to dream bigger than ever before. Maybe, they thought, maybe we could send humans to space, maybe even to the moon. Sputnik 1 had not just changed technology, it had changed imagination. For 21 days, the world listened. People of every language and country tuned in to the same sound, beep, beep, beep. It didn't speak English or Russian. It spoke the universal language of discovery. For the first time, the whole planet shared a moment of unity. No matter who you were, you could look up at the same night sky and feel connected. Even though the space race began as a rivalry, deep inside, many people realized something beautiful, that space belongs to everyone. Sputnik 1 taught humanity that impossible dreams can come true. It showed that with knowledge, courage, and teamwork, we can go beyond the limits of Earth. The little sphere inspired thousands of scientists and explorers. It led to the creation of weather satellites, communication systems, GPS, and even the internet one day. All of it started with that single beep in 1957. When Sputnik's orbit finally decayed, people didn't forget it. Museums built replicas. Artists painted it. Writers composed songs about it. It became a symbol of hope, proof that humans could reach the stars. The space race was no longer a secret project. It was now a global story. Every new rocket launch became headline news. Children dreamed of becoming astronauts. Governments poured money into research, and every scientist, no matter where they lived, wanted to be part of the next step. The world had crossed a line, from the age of airplanes to the age of space exploration. The sky was no longer the limit, it was only the beginning. The sound of Sputnik's beep beep still echoed across the world. For the Soviet Union, it was a song of victory. But for the United States, it was a wake-up call. The American people, proud of their nation's strength and science, suddenly realized something. They were not first. Someone else had reached space before them. And that changed everything. In the fall of 1957, when news of Sputnik spread, American homes were filled with surprise and worry. Families gathered around television sets. Children pointed at the night sky asking, "Can we see it, Daddy?" And parents wondered if that tiny dot above might one day mean danger. Because if the Soviet Union could send a satellite into orbit, it meant their rockets were powerful enough to reach anywhere, even across oceans. That idea frightened many people. Newspapers printed bold headlines, "Russians beat US into space." Radio announcers said things like, "The sky is no longer ours alone." But in the middle of fear came something stronger: determination. The American people decided they would not stay behind. They would rise to the challenge. They would reach higher and farther than ever before. In Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, the U.S. government moved quickly. President Dwight Eisenhower called emergency meetings with scientists, military officials, and advisors. He wanted to understand one thing: how did we fall behind, and how can we catch up? At that time, the American space effort was scattered. Different branches of the military were running separate rocket projects, the Army, Navy, and Air Force all competing with one another. There was no single organization focused on space. Eisenhower realized that needed to change. So plans began for a new, united space agency, one that would bring together the best minds from across the country. But that would take time. For now, America had to respond quickly and prove to the world that it too could reach space. The first test came just 2 months after Sputnik 1. On December 6, 1957, the U.S. prepared to launch its own satellite, Vanguard TV-3. Millions of people tuned in to watch live on television. The rocket stood proudly on its launch pad in Cape Canaveral, Florida, painted white and gleaming under the sun. Journalists and photographers waited with excitement. Then came the countdown. 10, 9, 8. At 0, fire and smoke burst from the base. The rocket lifted, just barely, rising 1 meter into the air. Then suddenly it exploded, crashing back down in flames. The crowd gasped. The broadcast went silent. Pieces of metal scattered across the pad. The tiny satellite rolled away, dented, useless. The press called it Flopnik and Kaputnik. It was embarrassing for the United States, especially after the world had watched the Soviet success. But instead of giving up, American scientists went back to work, determined to learn from their mistakes. While the Vanguard team struggled, another group had been working quietly behind the scenes, the U.S. Army Ballistic Missile Agency. Their leader was Dr. Wernher von Braun, a German-born rocket scientist who had moved to America after World War II. Von Braun had dreamed of space exploration since he was a boy. He didn't want to build weapons, he wanted to build spaceships. Now, his moment had come. His team proposed using their Jupiter C rocket, which they believed was ready for a satellite launch. After the Vanguard failure, the U.S. government finally agreed to let him try. On the night of January 31st, 1958, just 3 months after Sputnik 1, the U.S. tried again. The rocket stood tall against the dark Florida sky. Inside was a small satellite named Explorer 1. This time there were no television cameras, no grand speeches, just quiet hope. At 10:48 p.m., the engines ignited. The rocket lifted smoothly into the air, glowing orange against the clouds. Minutes later, it reached orbit. Success. America had finally entered space. Explorer 1 was smaller than Sputnik, but carried scientific instruments built by Dr. James Van Allen. These instruments discovered something new: belts of radiation surrounding Earth, now known as the Van Allen radiation belts. It was one of the first major scientific discoveries of the space age. With the success of Explorer 1, America's spirit was lifted. But leaders knew they needed something bigger, not just one satellite, but an organized, ongoing space program. So, on July 29, 1958, President Eisenhower signed a law creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. NASA's mission was clear: to lead the United States into space exploration for the benefit of all mankind. For the first time, space exploration was not just a dream or a military project, it was a national mission. NASA united thousands of scientists, engineers, and astronauts under one goal: to explore beyond Earth. Sputnik had also changed how Americans thought about learning. If they wanted to win the space race, they needed a new generation of scientists and engineers. Schools began to focus more on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the subjects we now call STEM. Children were encouraged to study space, rockets, and planets. Books about astronomy filled libraries. Teachers told their students, "You could be the one to design the next rocket. You could be the first to walk on the moon." It was the start of a new wave of curiosity and ambition. Young minds across America and around the world were now dreaming about space. The space race wasn't just about science anymore. It was also about politics. Each country wanted to show that its system of government was better. The Soviet Union said communism put the first satellite in space. The United States replied, "Democracy will take us further." Every rocket launch became a matter of national pride. Each failure or success was shown on the front pages of newspapers. The two nations weren't fighting directly, but their competition grew stronger with every orbit. By the late 1950s, both sides had launched multiple satellites. The Soviets were still ahead. They had launched Sputnik 2 with the dog Laika, and their rockets seemed bigger and stronger. But the Americans were catching up fast. NASA began planning missions to test human spaceflight. Before sending people, they needed to understand how the human body would react to zero gravity, radiation, and the pressure of takeoff. They studied animals, monkeys and mice, and sent them into short suborbital flights to gather data. Every mission taught them something new. The dream of sending a person to space was no longer fantasy. It was only a matter of time. NASA's first major project was called the Mercury program. Its goal was simple but historic: to send an American astronaut into space and bring them back safely. 7 brave men were chosen, the Mercury 7. They were test pilots, tough and fearless, trained to fly the fastest planes in the world. Their names would soon become famous: Alan Shepard, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, Gordon Cooper, and Deke Slayton. In 1959, they were introduced to the world as heroes. They smiled, waved, and told reporters, "We're ready to go." America now had its champions, ready to challenge the stars. The United States had turned its early fear into energy. its embarrassment into innovation. Within a few short years, it had built rockets, launched satellites, created NASA, and trained astronauts. But even as America advanced, the Soviet Union wasn't slowing down. They had new plans of their own, not just for satellites, but for sending the first human into space. The race that began with beeping machines would soon become a race of people, real human beings risking their lives for exploration. Both nations had learned important lessons. Failure wasn't the end, it was a teacher. Every explosion, every broken rocket, every lost satellite, all helped scientists improve. Behind every success was a team of men and women working long nights, often unseen, often unpaid extra hours, just to make sure the next launch went right. They didn't work for fame or medals. They worked for something larger, for the progress of humanity. Even though the world was divided by politics, space had a strange way of bringing people together. No matter which side they were on, everyone shared the same sky. When a rocket launched, people everywhere looked up. Scientists from different countries, even rivals, sometimes exchanged letters and data, quietly helping each other understand space better, because deep down, they all knew the stars belonged to everyone. Children in America, Russia, India, China, and Europe all began to share the same dream, to touch the stars. By the end of the 1950s, the space race had transformed the world. Just 10 years earlier, space travel seemed impossible. Now, it was the greatest adventure of all time. Satellites circled Earth, radio signals bounced from space to ground, scientists planned missions to the moon and beyond. The 1960s were just around the corner, and they would become the most exciting decade in space history. The next chapter of the race would no longer be about machines. It would be about humans, their courage, fear, and hope. And soon, one man would rise above the world and whisper words that would echo forever. "I see Earth. It is so beautiful." By the early 1960s, the race to space had become more than science. It was a race of courage. Satellites had flown, animals had flown, but one great question still remained. Could a human being survive in space? Would a person be able to breathe, eat, and think up there? Could their heart beat normally? Would they even be able to move in zero gravity? No one knew for sure. But two nations, the Soviet Union and the United States, were ready to find out. And at the center of it all stood a quiet, smiling man who would soon become a legend. Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin was born in 1934 in a small Russian village called Klushino. His parents were simple people. His father was a carpenter, and his mother worked on a farm. Yuri grew up during hard times, especially during World War II, when his family suffered like many others. But even as a child, Yuri was curious. He loved to build little model airplanes and watch birds fly. Sometimes he would look up at the wide sky and say softly, "One day, I will go there." After finishing school, he trained as a pilot in the Soviet Air Force. He was small in height, but strong in spirit, cheerful, disciplined, and full of hope. His bright smile made everyone around him feel calm. When the Soviet space program began searching for its first group of cosmonauts, people who would fly into space, Yuri Gagarin was chosen. Not because he was the biggest or strongest, but because he was brave, focused, and kind. The training was intense. The cosmonauts were tested in ways most people could hardly imagine. They were spun around in giant machines to test how much force their bodies could handle. They sat in small capsules for hours, learning to stay calm in tight spaces. They were dropped from planes to experience short moments of weightlessness. Doctors watched their heartbeats, breathing, and reactions. Scientists taught them about space, rockets, and orbits. They learned how to control the spacecraft manually in case of emergencies. It wasn't easy. Many times Yuri came home tired and sore. But he never complained. He kept smiling. He believed he was part of something bigger, something for all humankind. Finally, the day came. It was April 12, 1961. At a secret launch site in Kazakhstan, the Soviet rocket Vostok 1 stood tall on its pad. Inside, sitting in a small round capsule, was Yuri Gagarin, the first man ever to travel into space. Before takeoff, Yuri spoke a few simple words that became famous forever. Poyakili. At 9:07 a.m., the engines roared. Flames burst from the rocket, and it lifted off into the sky. The world's first human spaceflight had begun. People nearby watched in silence, tears in their eyes. For centuries, humans had dreamed of this moment, and now it was real. Inside the tiny capsule, Yuri felt enormous pressure as the rocket rose higher. The shaking was intense, but soon it stopped. The engine shut off, and for the first time, he felt weightless. Everything around him floated. A pencil, a small notebook, even his hands drifted upward. He laughed in surprise. Through the small window, Yuri looked outside and gasped. Below him was Earth. Blue oceans, white clouds, golden deserts, all slowly turning under him. It was breathtaking. He radioed back to Earth, "I see Earth. It is so beautiful." Those words became legendary, a message of peace and wonder that touched the entire world. Vostok 1 completed one full orbit around Earth in just 108 minutes. When the spacecraft began re-entry, flames surrounded it as it plunged through the atmosphere. Yuri stayed calm, trusting his team and his training. Moments later, he ejected from the capsule and parachuted safely to the ground near a small village. A farmer and her daughter saw him land in his bright orange suit. At first they were frightened. They had never seen anything like it. Yuri laughed gently and said, "Don't be afraid. I am a friend. I am from space." When the news reached the world, it spread faster than any other story in history. The first human had gone to space and returned alive. The Soviet Union celebrated with joy. People filled the streets, waving flags and shouting, "Yuri, Yuri!" He became a national hero overnight, and a hero to all humanity. Even in countries that were rivals, people admired him. In the United States, despite political tension, newspapers called him the Columbus of the cosmos. He had shown that humans could indeed survive beyond Earth. It was not just a Soviet victory. It was a victory for the entire human race. Yuri Gagarin traveled around the world afterwards, visiting dozens of countries. Everywhere he went, people cheered. They wanted to see the man who had touched the stars. He was humble and gentle. He never boasted or bragged. He always smiled and said, "I am just one man, but I carried the dreams of millions." Yuri believed that space should belong to everyone, not just one nation. He dreamed that one day people from all countries would fly together. His warmth and kindness made him not just a cosmonaut, but a symbol of peace. In the United States, Gagarin's flight created both admiration and urgency. Once again, the Soviets were ahead. America had to respond quickly, or risk falling behind forever. NASA accelerated its own human spaceflight program, Project Mercury. The Mercury 7 astronauts trained harder than ever, preparing to become America's first space travelers. On May 5, 1961, less than a month after Gagarin's flight, Alan Shepard became the first American in space. His spacecraft, Freedom 7, made a short suborbital flight, only 15 minutes long, but it proved that Americans, too, could fly safely in space. Crowds cheered, and Shepard became a hero. But everyone knew the Soviets were still ahead. Gagarin had orbited Earth. No American had done that yet. The following year, NASA launched another mission, Friendship 7. On February 20, 1962, astronaut Jen Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth. As his capsule circled the globe 3 times, he radioed back, "The view is tremendous." When he landed safely, America erupted in celebration. President John F. Kennedy awarded him a medal and told the world that the United States was now truly in the race. Glenn's courage inspired a nation that had once feared falling behind. Now, hope and pride returned. Though the space race was part of the Cold War, the men and women involved were not enemies. They were explorers, risking their lives for discovery. Yuri Gagarin and John Glenn never met, but they respected each other deeply. They were both pilots, dreamers, and symbols of human courage. Gagarin once said, "The Earth is very small. We must not fight one another, but protect it together." Those words carried great meaning, even today. The missions of Vostok and Mercury were simple compared to what came later, but they were engineering miracles. The spacecraft had no modern computers, just switches, dials, and courage. Gagarin's Vostok capsule was mostly automatic. He couldn't even steer it manually, unless ground control unlocked the controls. Alan Shepard's Mercury capsule was so small he could barely move his arms. Every mission pushed the limits of technology and human endurance. Each success built confidence for the next step, the next dream, to reach the moon. After seeing what the Soviets had achieved, U.S. President John F. Kennedy gave a historic speech in 1961. Standing before a crowd at Rice University, he said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." Those words lit a fire in the hearts of Americans. The goal was no longer just space, it was the moon itself. Both nations now looked upward, higher than ever before. The race was not slowing down, it was only speeding up. But space travel was dangerous. Many rockets exploded during testing. Some missions failed completely. Every astronaut and cosmonaut who stepped into a capsule knew they might never return. Yet they went anyway, not for fame, not for money, but for humanity's future. They believed that each flight brought all of Earth a little closer to the stars. Behind every launch were thousands of engineers, mechanics, doctors, and scientists. They worked day and night, often without sleep, all sharing one dream: to explore the unknown. Yuri Gagarin's flight changed the way humans saw themselves. He proved that Earth was not a boundary, it was home. And space was not impossible. It was the next chapter. Tragically, just a few years later, in 1968, Gagarin died in a plane crash while training for another flight. The world mourned deeply, but his legacy never faded. Statues were built in his honor, schools and streets were named after him, and every April 12th, people around the world celebrate Cosmonautics Day in memory of the first man who touched the stars. Even during the height of political rivalry, Yuri's journey reminded everyone of something greater, that Earth is one world, and space belongs to all. When astronauts look down from space, they don't see borders or flags. They see one round blue planet, fragile, beautiful, and alive. That simple truth began with a single man's journey, lasting just 108 minutes, but echoing through all of history. By the early 1960s, the space race was no longer just about who could send satellites or people into orbit. It had become a race toward a dream that had lived in human hearts for thousands of years: the moon. For centuries, people had looked up at that glowing silver circle in the night sky and wondered what it was like. Poets wrote about it, children pointed at it, lovers whispered under it. But no one had ever been there. It was mysterious, far, and unreachable. Now, suddenly, the dream did not seem so impossible. Humans had already touched space. The next question was simple, yet daring. Who would reach the moon first? On May 25, 1961, the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, stood before Congress. The world was listening. He spoke with confidence and hope, his voice firm but warm. "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." Those words became one of the most famous promises ever made. America had just sent its first men into space, and now the president was challenging his country to reach an entire world beyond. At that moment, the race to the moon officially began. Reaching the moon was no simple task. It was about 400,000 kilometers away, far beyond anything humans had ever traveled. To get there, you needed a rocket strong enough to escape Earth's gravity, a spacecraft tough enough to survive space, and a plan smart enough to bring the astronauts back alive. Scientists at NASA knew that it would take years of testing, failures, and courage. They would need to build rockets larger than anything ever seen. They would need to teach computers how to think. They would need astronauts willing to risk everything for the unknown. So they got to work, together. NASA created a new project called Apollo. Its mission was clear: to send humans to the moon and bring them back safely. The Apollo program would need many steps before it could succeed. First, they needed to develop new rockets. Then, they had to test capsules, navigation, and docking systems. The early missions, Mercury and Gemini, helped pave the way. Mercury proved that humans could survive in space. Gemini taught astronauts how to rendezvous, dock two spacecraft together, and work outside their capsules in space. Each mission was a small step, but each step moved humanity closer to the moon. The Soviets were not going to give up their lead easily. They had already sent the first satellite, the first man, and the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, into space. Now, they wanted the next great first, to reach the moon before the Americans. Soviet engineers worked day and night on new rockets and lunar landers. They sent unmanned probes, the Luna missions, to study the moon's surface. In 1959, Luna 2 became the first human-made object to impact the moon. Later, Luna 3 sent back the first pictures of the moon's far side, the part no one had ever seen before. The Soviets were still ahead, but America was catching up fast. To reach the moon, NASA needed a rocket strong enough to carry men, machines, and fuel into deep space. This led to the creation of the Saturn V, the largest rocket ever built. Designed by Werner Braun and his team, the Saturn V stood taller than a 30-story building. When it launched, its 5 engines produced more than 7.5 million pounds of thrust, enough to lift the weight of 400 elephants off the ground. Every part of it had to work perfectly. Even a tiny error could mean disaster. So thousands of scientists checked, tested, and retested every bolt, wire, and switch. The Saturn V was not just a machine, it was a symbol of human ambition. But the road to the moon was not without pain. On January 27, 1967, a terrible accident occurred during a ground test for the first Apollo mission. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were inside their capsule when a fire broke out. The pure oxygen inside fed the flames, and within seconds the 3 men were trapped. They could not escape. All 3 lost their lives. The nation mourned. It was a dark day for NASA. But the astronauts' sacrifice was not in vain. Engineers redesigned the capsule to make it safer, stronger, and better for the future. Their names, Grissom, White, and Chaffee, became symbols of courage and dedication. After the Apollo 1 tragedy, NASA tested step by step. Apollo 7, 1968, was the first successful manned test flight. It proved the new capsule was ready. Apollo 8 took an even bolder step. It carried 3 astronauts around the moon on Christmas Eve, 1968. As they orbited the moon, the crew looked out the window and saw something no human had ever seen before: Earth rising over the moon's horizon. It was a small blue planet, delicate and beautiful, floating in darkness. Astronaut Bill Anders took a photo that became famous forever: Earthrise. That image made people realize how fragile and precious our world truly is. While NASA was making progress, the Soviets were struggling. Their giant rocket, the N-1, was supposed to send cosmonauts to the moon. But every time they tested it, it failed. Engines exploded, tanks burst, and missions were delayed. The Soviets were also working in secrecy, so their mistakes were hidden from the world. Inside, engineers grew tired and discouraged. In 1966, their chief designer, Sergei Korolev, the man who had sent Sputnik and Gagarin into space, died suddenly during surgery. His loss was a heavy blow. Without his leadership, the Soviet program lost direction. The race was still on, but now America had a real chance to win. On July 16, 1969, hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Florida to watch the launch of Apollo 11. The crew? Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Their mission? To land on the moon. At 9:32 a.m., the Saturn V rocket came alive with a roar that shook the ground. Flames burst out, and slowly the rocket rose toward the sky. People cheered and cried. The whole world watched. It took 3 days to reach the moon. When they finally entered lunar orbit, Armstrong and Aldrin moved into a small lander called the Eagle. Collins stayed behind in the command module to orbit above. On July 20, 1969, the Eagle began its descent. Alarms sounded as the computer overloaded, but Armstrong stayed calm. With seconds of fuel left, he manually took control and landed the Eagle safely on the lunar surface. Then came the words the world will never forget. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Millions listened around the world as Armstrong opened the hatch and climbed down the ladder. His foot touched the gray dust of the moon, and he said softly, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Buzz Aldrin joined him soon after, describing the view as magnificent desolation. Together, they planted the American flag and set up experiments to study the lunar surface. They also left a plaque that read, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." Back on Earth, people in every country gathered around radios and televisions. From New York to Moscow, from Tokyo to Lahore, people watched in silence as two tiny figures walked on another world. Even those in rival countries felt pride and wonder. For the first time in history, humans had left their home planet and walked on another world. The space race was no longer just a competition. It was a moment for all humanity. After spending about 21 hours on the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin lifted off to rendezvous with Collins in orbit. They returned safely to Earth on July 24, 1969, landing in the Pacific Ocean. When they were brought aboard a ship, they were met with cheers, tears, and relief. They had done it. They had turned a dream into a reality. The world would never be the same again. With the Apollo 11 landing, the United States had won the space race. But more importantly, humanity had won. In the years that followed, 5 more Apollo missions landed on the moon. Astronauts collected rocks, drove moon rovers, and conducted experiments. The Soviets focused on space stations and robotic probes, building their own legacy in orbit. The rivalry slowly softened into cooperation. And a new idea was born, that perhaps one day nations could explore space together. The race to the moon was not just about rockets or flags. It was about belief. Belief that humans could do what once seemed impossible. Belief that science and dreams could work together. From a tiny beep beep of Sputnik to a footprint in the moon's dust, it took less than 12 years to change the course of history. The space race had begun as a competition between two nations, but in the end, it became a story of all humanity, a story of curiosity, courage, and hope. When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin returned from the moon in 1969, they were not just astronauts, they were messengers of hope. For the first time in human history, people had left their home planet, touched another world, and safely come back. The long race that began with a tiny beep-beep from Sputnik 1 had finally reached its greatest victory. But it was not the end. It was only the beginning. The moon landing changed how humanity saw itself. Before 1969, people looked up and saw mystery. After 1969, they looked up and saw possibility. It reminded everyone that the Earth was not the center of everything. It was just one beautiful planet in a vast universe. And more importantly, it showed that when people worked together, they could achieve things that once seemed impossible. When Armstrong and Aldrin returned, they were greeted by millions. Crowds lined the streets, flags waved, children shouted, "They went to the moon!" Even leaders from rival nations sent congratulations. For a moment, the Cold War paused. For a moment, the world felt united. The space race had started as a battle for pride, but it ended up giving the world tools of knowledge and progress. After the Apollo program ended in 1972, humans stopped going to the moon for a while, but exploration did not stop. Instead of aiming for new worlds right away, both nations focused on learning how to live in space. They built space stations, homes orbiting high above the Earth. The Soviets launched Salyut and later Mir, the first long-term space stations. American astronauts visited Mir years later, living and working with Russian cosmonauts side by side. Then, in 1998, a new dream came true, the International Space Station. The ISS was not owned by one nation. It was built together by many: the United States, Russia, Japan, Canada, and the European countries. It became a shining symbol of what humanity can do when it chooses unity over rivalry. Every day, astronauts from different countries float together, share meals, and conduct experiments that help life on Earth. They look out of their windows and see no borders, no flags, just one blue planet. Even as the ISS orbits above us, the spirit of exploration continues. New space agencies have joined the journey, from India, China, Europe, Japan, and many others. Private companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Rocket Lab are now building rockets too. Humans are planning to go back to the moon, this time to stay longer. NASA's Artemis program aims to build a base where astronauts can live, work, and prepare for journeys farther away, to Mars. Robotic missions already explore the red planet. Rovers like Curiosity and Perseverance drive across its dusty surface, searching for clues about ancient life. Space telescopes like the Hubble and James Webb look deep into the universe, showing us galaxies billions of light years away. Each picture reminds us of how small we are and how limitless our imagination can be. From the first fire made by early humans to the first footprint on the moon, one thing has never changed: our curiosity. We always want to know what lies beyond the horizon. The space race may have been born from fear and rivalry, but it awakens something much greater: the desire to explore, learn, and dream. It showed that bravery isn't just about fighting wars or climbing mountains. It's about daring to go where no one has gone before. Yuri Gagarin's smile, John Glenn's courage, Neil Armstrong's first step, they all remind us of what humans can achieve when we combine science with heart. Every launch, every mission, every discovery tells the same story: that humanity is one family under one sky. The space race taught the world many lessons. It taught that competition can inspire greatness, but cooperation creates peace. It showed that knowledge is more powerful than weapons. It proved that curiosity and courage can break any boundary. It also reminded us of how fragile our own planet is. From space, astronauts describe Earth as small, blue, and bright, floating in an endless sea of black. They say it looks peaceful, without borders, without nations. Seeing our planet that way changes people. It makes them realize how important it is to protect it, to care for it, and to live together in harmony. Every generation since the space race has grown up looking at the sky differently. Children dream of becoming astronauts, engineers, or scientists. They build small rockets in schools, learn about the planets, and imagine walking on Mars. Space is no longer something far away. It's part of our daily lives and our future. A child in Pakistan, Japan, America, or Russia can all look up at the same stars and dream the same dream. The dream that began with Sputnik still burns in every curious heart. It is strange to think that it all began with something so small, a shiny metal ball just 58 centimeters wide, launched into the sky one October night in 1957. That tiny satellite had no camera, no engine, no voice, only a soft beep, beep. But those beeps echoed around the world and across generations. They told humanity, you can go farther. They whispered, the stars are waiting. From that moment, humanity never stopped listening. When Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, his words became the symbol of all human exploration. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But the truth is, the leap is not over. Every new rocket, every new discovery, every new dream continues that same journey. Today, our spacecraft travel beyond the planets, carrying golden records with greetings from Earth in case someone, somewhere, hears them. Our telescopes see the birth of stars and the edge of time itself, and our hearts still look upward, wondering what comes next. The space race ended, but the human race towards knowledge has only just begun. As long as there are stars in the sky and questions in our minds, the story of space will go on. Because deep inside, we are all explorers. We are all made of the same dust that once shone in the heart of stars. And every time we look up, we remember that the universe is not far away. It begins right above our heads.